So it's a privilege to be here, in part because I really appreciate talking to business people. Like yourselves, I am an executive in a company. The magazine that I edit, Strategy+Business, is now 22 years old, and it was acquired 3 years ago, by PwC, the global accounting firm. So I sort of work, originally we were part of Booz Allen Hamilton, the federal contractor, known these days for employing people who are now hiding out in Russia. Our little operation was part of a 20,000 person enterprise then. We were spun off into a 3,000 person enterprise global consulting firm called Booz & Company, and then we were acquired by a 240,000 person enterprise. So before that I worked at a 10-person enterprise, and I've worked for myself. I have a feeling, no matter what size business you're working for, I'm with you. I have a feeling for what you do and the context of what you do. And I know that every business is self-contained and operating towards its own profitable direction. And I also know that every business is a creature of its context and its environment in a web of relationships that includes suppliers, distributors, regulators, shareholders, and of course, customers. And within that, we're all trying to find our way. And I like to think that the nature of a business is that a business is the sum of all of the decisions made during the course of a year or during the course of a day for that business. That's what it really is. It's a group of people together making decisions on behalf of a common purpose that may or may not be articulated, that generally involves sustaining itself and sustaining its employees by making a profit, but that often includes other things as well. And then within that context, every decision, every business decision is a bet on some theory about the way the world works. If you believe that people are basically good, then you're going to run your business very differently than if you believe that people are basically not trustworthy and need to be watched over. And a lot of the decisions we make about how to pursue a new opportunity, where to grow, what to invest in, these are all based on ideas that we may or may not make explicit. The management philosopher Elliot Jacks said that management today is where medicine was before the discovery of the circulation of the blood. In other words, there's a lot of ideas that are out there and we don't really know where they came from and we haven't really tested them. In many ways, I'm like the editor of a medical journal in the 17th century trying to decide which barber surgeons to feature, which leeches to write articles about, who's got the best phrenology skills, where's the really cool way to extract bile. And yet, and yet I'm not cynical about what we do, because I know that every year we learn more and more about what makes business work and what makes business work effectively. And I know that, I believe in progress, and I believe in the progress of ideas. I believe that, things are getting more reliable. And with the advent of big data and artificial intelligence and analytics, we're going to know much more about behavior. We're going to know about every shopper and their online behavior. We're going to know about the outcome of every marketing approach. We're going to know operations down to the gesture of either the human or robotic worker on the factory floor. We were talking a couple of minutes ago about, your insurance company is going to know when your foot on the accelerator wavers in such a way that it resembles somebody under the influence of alcohol, whether or not you are. And it's also going to know when your text. Someone's going to know whether your finger on when you're pressing the button on your smartphone, whether the motion sensors are detecting that it's in a moving automobile and that you're at the wheel. What we do with those types of information and all of the various types of information depends on our ability to manage ideas, to manage theories about the way the world works. What we do with all of our business decisions depends on our ability to gain and develop and embody the kind of judgment that reflects ideas about the way the world works. And that's not as grim as it may sound. It's a little bit, actually it is a little bit like weightlifting. And I don't know if anybody, so I started weightlifting 2.5 years ago. Since Randy mentioned it, I'll use that. And weightlifting, when you're a novice, is very daunting because one thing you know very well is that the wrong move can sort of shock your muscles and actually permanently sometimes, but can often debilitate you for weeks or months at a time. And you get very gun shy about doing the wrong thing. And you don't know what experienced athletes know, which is your muscles are telling you things. But they don't tell you, you have to ask. You have to, it's like when you're doing something for your pectorals or your deltoids or whatever, you don't like just do the exercise, you listen for the muscle, you wait for the sensation, and the sensation is not that strong. You have to kind of seek it out with your mind and learn to recognize it and learn, that muscle's being engaged because I'm doing it the right way, as opposed to I've got the wrong stance and therefore I must not be doing it right, and the way I can tell is because my glutes are not sending the signal that they would be sending if I was doing it correctly. Okay, I didn't know that. And because I didn't know that, for about 1.5 years I was completely mystified by this. I was like somebody following a regulator's instructions and complying, but not really knowing what I was doing or knowing why the regulations were there in the first place. Working with ideas in business is a little bit like that. Behind every idea is a perception of reality that is more or less better than it would be if you didn't have that idea to work with. But you kind of have to listen for it and build up your own discernment. And it's not like you're over here with like a score of, C+ and somebody's over here with a score of A in the idea discernment department any more than I'm going to the gym and comparing myself to somebody who can bench press, twice as much as I can, which is not that much. Your ability is comparable to the way your ability was before. And I can't prove this, but I believe I can make a case that your ability to thrive in your business will be raised by your proficiency in coming to recognize the messages in those ideas and listen for them. So I'm going to talk about 3 ideas out of many. There's hundreds of business ideas. I'm going to talk about 3 that are particularly kind of appealing to me, and I'm going to do it fairly quickly and then hopefully segue from that into conversation among us. So, the context for this is, I said that the magazine I edit is 22 years old. Well, 2 years ago, we had our 20th anniversary. By the way, you're going to see some slides like skip by really fast, and that's because this talk is abridged from another talk, but I think it's helpful to focus on just these few things, and they're really interesting. So I'm going to skip past all this. About 2 2 years ago then, we had our 20th anniversary, and we decided we were going to do a taxonomy of management ideas, like a genealogy chart, showing which ideas had led to which other ideas on through history. And we invited 10 eminent management historians, rock stars in the world of management history, completely unknown everywhere else. And we invited them to sit down, and they all brought Post-it notes with their ideas about which ideas had been really important. And we had 7 hours, and we put them all up on a wall, of which this was one small part. And we started arranging them, thinking that the genealogy chart would just pop out of there. And of course, 7 hours later, we were still arranging the Post-it notes in our first effort to make sense of them. One of the truisms of any field of study like this is that there are too many ideas to make sense of. You know, a human brain can really only keep 5 to 7 at any given time, 7 plus or minus 2, as the psychologists tell us. And therefore, you have to seek the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And so we sought simplicity. We decided ultimately that a genealogy chart was just too complicated. And instead, we would treat each idea as an answer to a business question, as something that would have practical value, because it had come up in the first place as people making operations and strategy work had tried to put them into practice. And so we grouped them according to the questions that we thought would be important. And so and we ended up with 500 ideas and 20 questions. And in the time we have here, I'm going to cover 3 questions and 1 idea for each. I think they're really cool questions and pretty cool ideas. And they have a lot of ramifications. As Randy said, they're not ideas with, they're ideas that can be implemented immediately, but not unambiguously. In other words, to take each one seriously and put them into practice is a bit of a leap of faith. And yet, to not do them is also a leap of faith, because even if you think you're not doing anything, you're still making decisions based on some bet about the way the world works. Okay. One of the first questions we thought of was the essential question of strategy. How do we win? How does our company achieve sustained success in a world of multiple competitors and constant change? And there are a lot of answers. Diversify, core competencies, execution, become a monopoly. Nice work if you can get it. Build big strategic planning operations. That one is a little less popular than it used to be. And then the one at the far right, differentiate your company from everyone else. In other words, can you develop an identity for your company and the capabilities to back it up that will make sure that you're separate from your competitors and that you'll continue to be separate from your competitors, because your success will allow you to keep investing in those capabilities and in that value proposition. And some of the most iconic, successful companies that we know have followed this strategy directly. I learned about it when researching and putting together a book called Strategy That Works that came out last year. But, I mean, is there a company that comes to mind whose success is based on their ability to consistently be different than any other company, including those in their industry? Apple. And Apple was in the book, and it has, you know, Apple's computers are not like other computers as a result of deliberate decisions made all through its history. And when it was in trouble in the late 90s, it doubled down on those decisions and has been served well. Others?
Zappos.
Zappos. And its parent company, Amazon, which has approached retail as you would approach retail if you didn't already have a retail background. And therefore, you know, one of the really interesting things about Amazon is that it's generally known as a company that offers, a large range of goods and delivers the next day. Delivering the next day is really problematic, right? I mean, we're all shoppers, right? And we don't really want something to come the next day. Those of you who are in retail businesses know how much shopping depends on impulse purchase. In order to overcome that disadvantage, Amazon had to create this amazing, distinctive capability in online user experience, so that the feeling of going online to an Amazon site is more compelling than it would be if you went somewhere else. And then they discovered that their customer experience was mediocre, and so they bought Zappos and gained the customer experience capability, again, in line with what they were trying to do in terms of being distinctive, that separated them from everybody else. Want to try one more? Which one?
Harley-Davidson.
Harley-Davidson is really good. We didn't cover that one in the book, but I know a little bit about Harley-Davidson through the work with Peter Senge, and it's an amazingly distinctive company. Everything, including the chrome on the engine, is different than the chrome that any other company uses. A final one is Starbucks, right? Starbucks sells coffee. But what they really sell is that third place experience, the place where you can go, where a customer can go and feel at home. A lot of places, a lot of retail stores can create a place that customers can go and feel at home. But Starbucks does it profitably while paying their frontline workers enough of a wage and giving them enough benefits that it establishes loyalty, and does that consistently in stores that are slightly different but also the same around the world. That's a tremendous capability and a tremendous distinguishing factor. A really interesting question is does it make sense to be distinctive if you're not a global company? If you're, say, a local business or in a more constrained environment. And the authors of that book, I was kind of the with writer. The authors of that book argue that as the competitive environment increases, your ability to be distinctive, to do things and have capabilities that nobody else can match, will set you apart in any environment. But it's going to take, it takes a lot of diligence and effort to be a truly distinctive company, because not only do you have to really invest in the things that are going to make you distinctive, but you have to be very deliberate about the things you don't invest in. And a lot of times it means giving up on projects that didn't work out or that somebody really likes in your organization or that have been favored or that are in your past, like GE selling its appliance business or its light bulb business, which it wants to do now, because it wants to double down on its capability as a purveyor of industrial infrastructure. Why is it doing that? Because it now recognizes that its survival depends, even at a company that size, on differentiating itself from everybody else. Okay, that's idea number one. I thought that was cool. I'll skip this one, except to show that I think W. Edwards Deming is very interesting. But here's an idea. Here's the question, one of the 20 questions that I'm sure has never occurred to anybody in this room. How can I possibly get everything done? And there are a lot of answers, including make lists, do less, begin with the end in mind, stay out of your inbox. You won't, get used to it. But the answer, the idea that I like the best it's come from a number of places, but there's a writer named Adam Gopnik who writes for The New Yorker. He's a literary writer, but he wrote an incredible management article called Looking for Mr. Ravioli. And it starts with his daughter. who was at the time was 3 years old. This is a number of years ago. This was in the age of before voicemail had replaced answering machines. And he tells a story. His 3-year-old daughter has an imaginary friend called Charlie Ravioli. And she would talk about having set up play dates with Charlie Ravioli, but Charlie Ravioli would always cancel the play dates because he was too busy. And then she would say, I'm going to have lunch with Charlie Ravioli, but I can't plan it because he'll just cancel, so I just have to show up when he's going to have lunch and, bump into him. Or she would have these phone conversations with Charlie Ravioli where she would call him up and, say, Charlie, can you meet me now? Oh. Well, then leave a message on my answering machine. And then Charlie Ravioli, her imaginary friend, got an imaginary assistant to schedule the play dates that would then be canceled by the assistant on behalf of Charlie Ravioli. And, her parents are watching this and thinking, does our child have a personality disorder? What is her problem? This is in New York, but I'm sure that there are similar things going on in many other places, most other places. It turns out, of course, that the child didn't have a personality disorder, but was simply mimicking and echoing the adult behavior that she saw around her with her 2 professional, highly connected parents. And so Adam Gopnik began to research the roots of busyness. And being a literary type of guy, he started looking in literature, and he discovered that Samuel Pepys and other 17th and 18th century writers did not talk about being busy as a problem. They were creating what we now think of as middle-class society in London. Samuel Pepys had a navy to refloat and a burned London to rebuild, but he never complained of being busy. For him, being busy was a synonym for being happy, not being stressed. And then by the end of the 19th century, it's all changed. Virginia Woolf is always complaining about having to race across London. Henry James complains about being busy all the time. What changed? 18th century, busy is great. 19th century, I'll get back to you on your voicemail. What changed, and is there an idea in there about how we might manage our time better? Technology, which ones? Email? Well, this was 19th century. What was the email equivalent of the 19th century? Telephone, and before that? Telegram. And then you said transportation, and which transportation? The railroads. And then the automobile. And what was the factor that led these to make people busy? Why would this make a difference? If you had to isolate one change, we knew more people. Suddenly, the circle of acquaintances, not friends, but acquaintances, grew longer, and every acquaintance that is meaningful carries a certain obligation. And people started fulfilling those obligations, and suddenly we became busy, and busyness meant stress. What I take away from this is 2 things. First, don't look at your email inbox. And secondly, be deliberate about your acquaintanceships. The nature, the essence of successful business is knowing people. And there is something very noble about exchange, having something of value to exchange and receiving either money or goods in return for what you exchange, or services. That is, I believe in that as a noble act. But in order to do that, we need to know quite a few people. But many of us, or at least I'll speak for myself, I, at times, get distracted by the web of acquaintanceships. If I'm going to manage my time, maybe I don't need to manage my inbox. Maybe I need to manage the way in which I manage people more effectively. So that's a second idea. And then the third one, we called this "What the hell is leadership?" because we just couldn't think of any better way to phrase it. What is leadership? And we had Machiavelli as one author. I've been working with a neuroscientist named Jeffrey Schwartz and an executive coach named Josie Thompson. And we're working on a book called The High Road Less Traveled. And this is an idea from that. So this is kind of personal for me. I think it's a cool idea. It's not entirely mine, but I've kind of helped bring it to life. And the idea is that there are two types of leadership of an enterprise or an organization. There's the leadership where you're transacting and getting things done and making deals and giving people what they want and buying and selling products and doing things right, and that is powerful and valuable. Business could not survive without it. But in a time when organizations, business, government, nonprofits, in a time when every organization is challenged by things we don't expect, technological change, global competition, competition coming from out of nowhere, insights about human nature changing, new contexts, we also need a kind of leadership that could be called strategic leadership. The ability to take an organization in a direction it hasn't tried to go before and actually get there. And that requires something from senior decision makers that goes beyond our transactional ability. And neuroscientists are increasingly looking at what goes on in effectiveness in making decisions and operating in the world. And so Jeffrey and I and Josie have an idea that seems to be backed up by the literature that suggests there are two patterns of mental activity that are common among decision makers, or at least easy to get to among decision makers. And they tend to be associated with two parts of the brain. And one part of the brain happens to be not directly, but above the other part of the brain. So we call them the high road and the low road. The low road is the transactional part of the mental activity that seeks expedience. You know, how can I please people? What do they want? What do I want? How can I make a good deal that gives other people what they want and me what I want? When you think that way, you trigger aspects of the brain that have to do with habits and sense that something is wrong, which Jeffrey calls the warning center, and the self-referencing center, the reactive part of it, which has to do with thoughts about your identity and who you are. These get triggered, and the more you think in that way, the easier it is to think in that way, because habits of thought actually make a physical difference in the way each of our brains operates, if they're repeated over time. So there's a habit of transactional thinking, which we call the low road. And then there's a habit of generative, strategic thinking, in which we call the high road. And in order to take the high road, you think in ways that seem a little counterintuitive to people at first. And you kind of have to force yourself to do them in the same way that you have to force yourself to have the right posture when you're lifting weights for the first time. So one of the things you do to take the high road, and the high road connects that same self-referencing center, a different part of it which is more deliberative, with that same warning center which says, you know, something's coming here I need to attend to, with that same, but now instead of with the habit center, it connects it with the executive center, it connects it with the executive center. And the place that is associated with long-term actions and the marshmallow test, seek delayed gratification, and self-control. And the two practices associated with that circuit are mindfulness and mentalizing. Mindfulness is paying attention to your own thinking and attention. People associate that with meditation. Meditation is one way to practice mindfulness. But being aware of your thoughts, realizing that when you have a shock or a concern or a fear, that's not reality, that is your thought, and needs to be looked at and thought about before you can react to it effectively. That's mindfulness. And so mindfulness will inevitably involve you in thoughts like, what am I thinking? What does this thought mean? Why am I thinking this right now? I'm angry. What does that mean? What exactly is making me angry? I'm elated. What should I be watching out for? What does this emotion, this thought, this perception mean? And then the second thing is known as mentalizing. And this is the habit, the practice of thinking about what other people are thinking and what they're likely to do. Not what they want, not what you want, but what are they likely to do and why, and what are they thinking and who are they? Mentalizing is something that most of us do pretty well on an informal basis. But oddly enough, autistic people cannot do it. There's a test of mentalizing which is associated with the phrase theory of mind, where you show an image to an autistic person or to anyone and say, what was this a picture, a photograph. And you say, what was this person thinking? And most of us can guess, actually, pretty well what someone was thinking at the time the photograph was taken. But autistic people cannot. They lack the cues. So there are a lot of cues that we give each other about what we're thinking and what we might be likely to do next. The ability to pick up on those cues, however, requires a certain amount of effort. And it's often associated with people of relatively low status. So for instance, you'll find an administrative assistant mentalizing about his or her boss more than you'll find the boss mentalizing about the administrative assistant. One of the paradoxes of mentalizing is that as you rise in the hierarchy, you need mentalizing more than ever to do this kind of strategic leadership, but you're more inclined to think, well, I've paid my dues. I don't have to mentalize anymore. I don't have to think about other people anymore. They're going to think about me. And as you do that, and as you get into that habit, your ability to do the kind of generative strategic leadership we're talking about tends to disappear. This is one of those cases where the most practical thing you can do to build that capacity for strategic leadership doesn't seem practical at all. It's mindfulness and mentalizing, thinking in a different way. And sooner or later you gain the ability, if you do this enough, you gain the ability to think about yourself the way someone else who is observing you would think about you. What am I thinking? What am I going to do next, and why? And is what I'm contemplating the right thing to do? If I were watching somebody else do what I'm thinking about doing, what would I tell them? And you start listening for that in your mind, and it's almost like you're consulting what Jeffrey Schwartz calls a wise advocate in your own mind. And that act of consulting that inner voice becomes more and more commonplace, and sooner or later, if you do it enough, it becomes second nature to you. And by the end of the time you're doing it, or by the middle of the time you're doing it, you find yourself taking on that same role in the organization around you that your internal wise advocate is taking on with you. And people start coming to you as the voice of, what are we doing? What are we thinking? What are we likely to do next? And what should we do? And that role becomes part of your presence in the organization. Highly ephemeral. You wouldn't think it's practical at all. but it becomes a vehicle for making a difference. One of the ideas underlying this is that the way we think when it's habitual has tremendous tangible effect. And we choose the way we place our attention and where we place our attention. And those choices, echoed in decision after decision, add up. So those are 3 out of hundreds of ideas. And the point is not to think that any one of them is the answer, but rather to cultivate the ability to raise enough of them to raise our own game. And I just like coming here and talking about them. So I feel very privileged that you've given me this much time to explicate these 3. I don't know how much time we have.
20 minutes.
So we have 20 minutes for conversation, if you'd like it. Either observations or questions or comments, concerns. This is tough.
So where do you see your business going next?
My business?
Yeah.
The magazine or PwC?
Both.
Both. Well, PwC is coming to terms with the reality that every accounting firm is coming to terms with, which is how much of our work will be automated. Now, PwC does, beyond accounting, it does advisory work, consultation, and I'm more aligned with the consultation part. But I think it's true of every professional services firm. To what extent is what you do automated, automatable, and when it becomes automated, what happens to the part that can't be automated? Does that become of more value or less value? And we can't fully know the answer to that question, but what we can do is we can look intensely at the value that our guidance provides and how to raise that value, and especially how to distinguish it from both our competitors and from what we think a machine would do. And I don't think it's a secret that PwC is actively looking at that now, and so is every other major accounting firm and professional services firm. In terms of the magazine, so this is what the magazine looks like. This is, in fact, the 20th century issue, 20th anniversary issue that I was referring to, where we showed the 20 questions. I brought it here for moral support. Here's what the original page layout looked like. Very complicated, right? 20 questions, hundreds of answers. Who's going to make sense of all that? You make sense of it one piece at a time. We don't know how many years we're going to continue publishing on paper.
I was just going to ask that.
More than 2. I would have to guess less than 20. We do know that we are in constant competition with many, not just other professional services firms, but with where people go for information. And we aspire to be the place where if you're interested in management thinking, you come to us first before Harvard Business Review. Strategy and Business was founded by a former disgruntled Harvard Business Review editor, of whom there are many. And he was a wonderful guy named Joel Kurtzman, who passed away actually just a couple, I think last year or the year before. And it kind of was a magazine that shouldn't exist. It was taken up by Booz Allen Hamilton with the idea that they couldn't get into Harvard Business Review as often as they wanted to, so they'd create their own. They'd create a magazine with external contributors and internal contributors, and that way when they had an idea, they'd be sure of finding a vehicle for it. But they didn't call it the McKinsey Quarterly. They didn't just publish, or the Booz Allen Quarterly. They called it Strategy and Business, with the idea that people would come to it as an independent source of insight. And they perceived that there was a gap. Well, there was a gap. And the magazine did thrive, and it now has 1.3 million readers, regular readers in its various forms, 90,000 in print and the rest in various online forms and digital forms. But if I were to walk out on the street and say, you know, how many people have heard of strategy in business, even in a business gathering, the answer would be too few. So my goal is to figure out what we need to do to be, without increasing our budget. We do accept advertising, so we're entrepreneurial in that sense, and we do have a few other ancillary sources of income, but a lot of what we do is what has come to be known as sponsored content. We're not really dependent, you know, we're not enough of a marketing vehicle for real sponsored content, and we're not independent enough to be fully independent in our financing. So that's why I say we shouldn't exist. We're like, you know, we just keep unicycling along the high wire and not looking down, and the only thing that keeps us going is the fact that our quality is high. So our goal is to continue to find contributors, continue to raise our quality, and jumpstart our ability to let people know what we do.
So with the automation of professional services, how important will relationship marketing be?
Extremely important, because it can't be automated. The services you provide, you may have more ability to provide a variety of services, and you may have more ability to know which services will fit your immediate need. That's a very low-road approach. And one of the this hasn't occurred to me before, but it is possible that the low road can be automated, or parts of it. The high road cannot. Being able to have the kind of relationship where you're able to think about what your client or customer really would want to have happen next if they knew. That's a high road activity. Doesn't mean it's better than a low road activity. It just means that it's more thinking about what people are going to be doing next as opposed to what they want right now. And I don't think that will be automatable.
So don't you think companies that have a strong relationship department ability will be the ones that win?
I do. I wouldn't say a department, I'd say a capability or an ability, which is as much cultural as it is formal. You were going to...
Yeah, you were talking about earlier about being over busy and knowing too many people. And I told Steve if we could play golf together, he'd be off the list.
I said, I'm a C inventory item.
Well, you have a very special day once a week.
There has to be a reasonable criterion.
But now, when you think about business strategy and the challenge we have of making better decisions with an enormous access to information that is out there, and the feeling that if we don't cover all the bases, we're going to make bad decisions. That kind of, how do you balance busyness and knowing and this idea that we're over busy and over connected with the responsibility of sorting through all that data that's out there so we can make good business decisions?
Not to belabor it, but how do I know when I go into the gym that I'm not going to really hurt myself? I could be extremely conservative about what I do and not take on extra weight or challenge myself in any way, and then I'd make no progress. You could argue that I should always have a trainer or a spotter, or a friend, but I've just said that having too many other people will be damaging, and I don't always want to have a trainer or a spotter. And they don't always do as much for me as I do for myself, honestly. Everything depends on my ability to observe and listen, and it's very active, and it's listening, for me it's listening for my muscles, but it's also listening for my readers, for the magazine, and listening for my customers. And my relationship marketing, it's listening for those with whom I have a relationship. It may be listening for the regulators. You know, what do they really want with this rule? What's actual commitment to our shared goal as opposed to simply complying with the regulation? And could I possibly have a conversation with them about it? These are not things that can be determined by pattern. They depend on having the capability within oneself. And one of the startling things for me, for a while I did hurt myself and I had to go to physical therapy, and I had like a kind of a little meltdown with my physical therapist the first day. I said, how am I supposed to learn all this? You know, what am I supposed to do when you're not here? When I'm like on my own trying to figure out how to prevent myself from having another injury. And he looked at me and he said, well, first you lower your voice, and then you have to build, you know, you could go to school for 2 years or more, like I did, 4 years or more, or you could just recognize that you're going to be building, you're going to be coming to that understanding over time, and go as far as your understanding will take you. And you're going to have to trust me to some extent when I say that this aspect of it, I have assurance, will get better. Your knee will stop throbbing in pain after a certain amount of time. And then we'll work on the next thing because we'll figure it out. Everything depends on individual judgment. And there aren't, I don't know if you remember the movie, the original Pirates of the Caribbean. So there's this sort of scenery chomping scene where Keira Knightley has been kidnapped by pirates, and the head pirate is Geoffrey Rush, and he's like the epitome of evil. And she's righteous, and she knows that, you know, she's playing by the rules, and she's very organized, and she's just given him what she wants. And now they're, instead of like dropping anchor and putting her back to shore with the, you know, back to the city and safe, they're sailing away with her, and she doesn't know why. And she runs up to him all indignant, and she says, you know, the pirate's code, because she knows all about the pirates and their arcane rules. And she says, the pirate's code says you have to put me to shore. And he turns to her and he says, first of all, the pirate's code is for pirates. And you're not a pirate. And secondly, I never actually said I was going to put you to shore, did I? And third, the pirate's code is not really rules. It's more like what you'd call guidelines. It's sort of like, welcome to your world and welcome to the working world, oh graduate of a business school. He actually says, welcome to the Black Pearl, Missy, and then he stalks away. I often think of that when I'm in my day-to-day decision making, because honestly, most of the things that I stand by are, if there are rules involved, there's always a workaround. But the question of which workaround to take and when to take it requires a level of judgment that is not easy to come by, as an executive at Wells Fargo or Volkswagen could tell you, or United.
When you're talking about the generative strategic high road, and if the bosses at the location think that they understand what the people want, and they aren't really doing the mentalizing, they haven't done the mentalizing, you know, it's really kind of scary to give up what you definitely think they want versus listening to them, because for a while there you have nothing. You don't understand either way. How can, as a support person, how can I support them to make that change, and what kind of things can I do to facilitate it?
Welcome to the Black Pearl, Miss Turner. So I'm in that position quite a lot. And those who were here last night will hear me say something I said last night again. Strategy in business is roughly 15 people. but we're highly visible because we're media within a larger organization. And we were acquired. So some might have felt we were countercultural to the larger organization, in a situation quite like the one you described. Bosses who were distant, and we didn't really understand each other that well. But we knew, and I suspect this, from the way you described your situation, I suspect this is true of you as well, we knew that we were valued. And in part we were valued because we were bringing something that was countercultural, but that was perceived as necessary. And the reverse was also true. Their size and scope was not the, and their willingness to support us was not the only thing we valued about them. We soon came to discover that they had insights and ways of looking at the world that were intensely valuable to a magazine and made us different from every other management magazine, and that we could really work together. But it took some effort. And one of the things so as you've noticed, I tend to make up catchphrases for situations, and I found myself talking to a group of editors, some of whom were new and coming in with us, and some of whom were, had been with PwC a while and were kind of beaten down a little bit. And we were all talking about how to deal with all the various rules and issues that we would find in a 220-person organization, any 220-person organization. And I found myself using the phrase insouciant savoir-faire. In other words, we were going to be doing some things that were valued, but that would create almost unintentionally at times, that would raise hackles or create dissonance. And we weren't always sure how they were going to be taken. But we would have two things going for us. One is, no matter what, we would not be anxious. Not only would we not show anxiety, but we wouldn't let ourselves be anxious. And if we saw each other being anxious, we would talk each other out of it. And we'd try to get in that habit. And we'd back up our insouciance with savoir-faire. In other words, we would know what we were doing, and we would look at our work the way we thought the others we were dealing with would look at us. I suspect you do this as well. And we would get into that habit as well. So for example, we had a problem early on with what to put on the cover of the magazine. In other words, we were part of PwC, but we also used a different brand, which is Strategy and, the strategic business that PwC takes to market for its strategy consulting work. Should we put Strategy and on the cover, PwC on the cover? What should we do? And we had to, this is a print magazine, the decisions have to be made weeks, months in advance sometimes of the actual appearance. And we didn't know. Nobody knew. And we kept asking for a decision, and nobody would give us a decision. So finally, I wrote an email that said, in big bold letters, I am making a decision. And the decision is, we're going to put such and such on the cover. I don't even remember what it was. And here's the rationale for it. And I sent it to everybody who could possibly have an interest in this. And I got no response whatsoever. And then weeks went by, and the cover appeared. And I forgot about the email. And then I got a call with the 3 most dreaded words that you can ever hear in any corporation. Who authorized this? And after I had resuscitated myself a little bit, I started looking around, and the managing editor of the publication had saved that email. And I discovered that, in fact, I did have savoir-faire because tracking every decision we made was a relatively small thing to do that you might not think to do, but thereafter we have tracked every decision we make. And we do it in part because we are a regulated, we are part of a regulated company, but we do it also because, honestly, it forces us to be sure that we have good judgment. That doesn't mean compliant, sort of That doesn't mean cautious judgment. It means being, and often we will do things that might be considered bold or intemperate or edgy. But we do them knowing that if somebody says, who authorized this, we will have thought it through. And sometimes that leads us to do things that are bolder than we otherwise would do, because it's, in our opinion, the right thing to do, and then we can defend it. It's a long way of saying I've been there.